success means something else when you're Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. When you're not only a Final Fantasy game, but a remake to perhaps the most beloved title in the series, then, well, the stakes are definitely a bit higher, as are the conditions for success. And gauging it against the very metrics that the game itself had to hit to be a success, well, I'm firmly of the mind and the belief that Rebirth was actually not a success, despite how impressive and strong of a game it really is. So that's what I want to break down today. I want to focus in on what Final Fantasy VII Rebirth does right, what it does wrong, and how all of it, when looked at as a whole, is perhaps a very ambitious miss rather than a solid hit for both the Remake Trilogy and the Final Fantasy VII franchise as a whole. Now, a bit of a warning before we begin. This video is going to have spoilers for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, it's going to have spoilers for Final Fantasy VII Remake, and of course the original Final Fantasy VII up till the point that Rebirth ends at. So, if you haven't played through Rebirth yet, and plan to, then well, as always, viewer discretion is advised here. Before we talk about anything Rebirth related, I think it's worth stating that, regardless of your own personal tastes and likes, Final Fantasy VII, the original, is one of the most impactful and monumental RPGs of all time. Understanding that is, I think, the very first puzzle piece that's needed to piece together Rebirth's eventual outcome and success or failure. Final Fantasy VII was released by a then Squaresoft in 1997 on the original Sony PlayStation, and is not only credited as being the game that brought RPGs into the mainstream, but is also known to be largely responsible for creating a new era and a standard for video game RPGs and RPG stories. Final Fantasy VII was so memorable and so impactful for so many people that the game morphed from the 7th entry in a long-running RPG series to its own mammoth franchise, producing a ton of spin-off games, prequels, sequels, and related media properties. Final Fantasy VII was and really is one of publisher Square-Enix's biggest video games. And there's always been this one big problem with the franchise. A problem that's gnawed at both fans and likely Square-Enix themselves for quite a while now. See, the game, in its original form, was stuck in the era of the original PlayStation, the era where it came out. As Final Fantasy VII continued to endure, both in the minds and hearts of fans, and in those working at Square-Enix itself, the hunger and urgency for a remake of the game, updated to modern graphics and gameplay sensibilities, has become more and more of a need rather than a want. And so, after years of teasing an updated Final Fantasy VII with CG trailers and tech demos and whatnot, Square-Enix ultimately made the jump to actually release and make a proper high-budget and updated version of Final Fantasy VII with Final Fantasy VII Remake. And after 10 years of a rather tumultuous development cycle, the game released in April of 2020. But there was a twist. See, instead of this remake being a recreation of the original beloved game, Remake was the first part of a longer expanded version that would take place over a series of games. To make matters even more interesting and a little bit strange, Remake, the first in this series of games, only covered the first few hours of the original game, which was set in the city of Midgar, and those hours were expanded into a full-blown 60-hour RPG experience. And even more confusing for fans were the extreme changes to Final Fantasy VII's story in Remake. These changes hinted at the game not just being a recreation of the original, but rather a sequel to the original game, with various aspects and things clearly different, hinting at a potential divergence of the story into completely new, uncharted territory. And to say that this bothered some fans was putting it mildly. If there's one thing that has probably divided fans of Final Fantasy VII more than anything, it's this direction that the remake took with some of the minor changes it did, and then ultimately how the game ended. At the end of Remake, what you end up doing is essentially having Cloud and his entire party defeat and destroy the Guardians of the Timeline, known as the Whisperers. And the implication here is that now, both the players and the development team are kind of free to go off script here, and go in perhaps a completely different direction than the original Final Fantasy VII. And so, with that question, the question of where things would go from here, lingering in fans' minds, as they crafted theories, debated, whined, and praised this particular decision in some cases, 4 years went by, and then, in 2024, the second part of the now confirmed Remake Trilogy, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, arrived. And from the onset, for both players jumping back into the world of Final Fantasy VII, and for the developers providing the second game in their ambitious project, the question of whether Final Fantasy VII's Remake Trilogy was going to be a sequel, or whether it was going to be a proper remake of the original, was the core question that a lot of people wanted an answer to. So, that really is the first thing that really determines Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's success. How it addresses this whole issue of the Remake Trilogy being either a sequel or a remake. And to that end, after playing through the whole game and seeing all that it had to offer and what it was pointing towards, the answer to that particular question and issue was a rather surprising one, at least for me. In a rather strange turn of events, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth most definitely tilts the scale firmly in the direction of a retelling or a remake of the original story, rather than that sequel idea that had so many fans so divided. See, after Final Fantasy VII Remake, the first game in the trilogy came out and was finished by fans, the prevailing theory about this whole remake project was that it was actually a sequel in disguise. There was that whole thing with the Whisperers at the end, but there were other hints that the events of the original Final Fantasy VII had actually already happened, and that this remake was actually a second timeline, where two opposing forces in the story's antagonist Sephiroth and the story's main female lead in Aerith were fighting for a different, newer outcome from the original. And that idea, well, there was something to it. For one thing, there's a whole after-credits scene where a character known as Zack Fair, who's pretty central to the setup for Final Fantasy VII's story, well, he's shown to be alive. And not only him, but there are other characters that die in the events of the remake itself, that are shown to be alive. And well, all of that, it seemed to point to Remake being nothing more than a clever play on words. And the game as a whole questioning the very notion of what a remake is supposed to be. Should it simply be a retelling, or can it be a reimagining and reinvention of the original story? But, as clever as this idea may have seemed, and as much as people like me loved it, it's clear that the larger fan base of Final Fantasy VII and the newcomers to the series didn't take to this particular idea. And the more I think about it, the more I kind of ask myself, can I really blame them? I mean, Final Fantasy VII Remake was positioned as a remake, as a retelling of the original in its marketing and throughout the various press events for the game. Fans of the original, who really love Final Fantasy VII, who want to share it and want to re-experience it, don't really want a sequel. All they want is a game that immortalizes and brings back their beloved game into the modern day. And that's to say nothing of the original need for Final Fantasy VII to have an updated modern version that could serve as a jumping on point for newcomers. That need was definitely not going to be fulfilled by this bold and ambitious sequel idea. An idea, by the way, that the director of the original Final Fantasy VII and the executive producer on this remake trilogy, Yoshinori Kitase, had originally wanted to pursue. In an interview with Push Square all the way back in May of 2020, Kitase had something rather interesting to say about all of this. He said, and I quote, I personally envisioned quite a dramatic change overall, but our director, Tetsuya Nomura, and co-director, Naoki Hamaguchi, wanted to keep the beloved aspects in the original as much as possible. Eventually, the development team decided to focus on respecting the original while adding in new elements, ensuring a delicate balance between the two. End quote. So, this whole quote here, from all the way back in 2020, really kind of eclipses a sort of internal tug of war that both the players and the developers of the Remake Trilogy have kind of become embroiled in. Now, it's worth noting that if you're a game developer, the most boring thing you can do is work on a project that you originally made again. Game developers, and honestly just creators in general, want to continue to forge ahead and craft and create new things. Being stuck, working on the one thing that you made, however great it may be, is honestly kind of the death of creativity. And personally, as someone who's fine with experiencing games as they were and are, I was more on board with the idea of not only really keeping nothing sacred, but really just messing with everything. That, to me, is a lot more interesting because it keeps things new and fresh, but also leaves room for a ton of surprises and exceeded expectations. But, my own thoughts aside, there's a bigger question that emerges from both this remake versus sequel idea and in how Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the second game, decides to ultimately ditch the whole sequel approach and kind of steers the ship back towards making this game a retelling of the original. And that question really is the question that the team behind Final Fantasy VII Rebirth needed to decide and firmly focus in on. The question of who exactly this game is for. It's a question that really has to do with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and the Remake Trilogy as products, rather than as works of art or literature. Games, as much as we'd like to look at them as works of art, are really products that are meant to be sold to consumers and ultimately are meant to entertain them. To that point, you can either give fans exactly what they want and please them, or you can ultimately decide that players don't know what they want, or that there is a newer audience that you want to chase. And in that case, you take a different approach and attempt to win everyone over by sheer effort, by sheer force and expert execution. Both paths come with their own pitfalls and challenges to overcome, but I think, at the end of the day, it's in deciding on what approach to take and who exactly to target and how that you come to be able to succeed at making a product and a video game. And so, to come back to that question, who does Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and this whole remake trilogy ultimately serve? Who is this for, and how? Well, that's really the first issue that I think Rebirth has. Its lack of commitment to either approach or lane, with regards to the sequel versus remake idea, and then subsequently, its lack of commitment to a particular audience. Yes, Rebirth as a story and as a game definitely tends to stick towards preserving the events of the original, and almost downplays the "this is actually a sequel" idea that felt so blatant in 2020's remake. But then, the game also has these segments throughout its runtime where you get to control Zack and explore an alternate reality or world. And of course, then there's the game's own ending, that really, after 100 hours of a game that's seemingly keeping fairly close to the original story events, suddenly goes ahead and changes and adjusts perhaps one of the most notable and famous story moments of the original Final Fantasy VII. And it changes it into a vague, confusing, ambiguous mess. In this situation, I really feel like the team behind the Remake Trilogy have put themselves into a bit of a corner. In trying to appease everyone and do the whole "this is a remake but slightly different," they are, more than likely, actually serving no one. For fans like me, that wanted the whole sequel and alternate story idea, well, we just got shafted by what Rebirth's overall story provides here. And for those OG fans, that wanted the original to be both preserved and embellished. Well, they got pissed off and left a whole video game ago. You know, when Remake suggested that things were going to be completely different. Well, if the goal was to win those fans back, then well, this new ending at the end of Rebirth is certainly not going to do any favors with that audience, I'll tell you. And so yeah, despite the strengths of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, of which there are many, and to which we'll get to shortly, I promise, this whole lack of commitment to one approach has hurt both the game's reception and its sales among fans. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth sold less than its prequel, and has been more or less a disappointment for Square-Enix, as we mentioned earlier, which ultimately means that everybody kind of lost, doesn't it? I mean, fans of the original aren't happy, fans of this new remake the story idea aren't happy, newcomers are likely confused, and the company itself isn't all too happy about not selling enough copies, and making that huge profit on their rather mighty investment into this game and franchise. Now, what makes this such a darn tragedy, and a real shame, is that underneath the weight of that one particular core decision is a game that shows a real sense of dedication, effort, support, and a desire to evolve from the developers that have now toiled away on this whole project for a good 15 years. There's a real drive to push Final Fantasy forward in a way that I'd argue has been needed for decades now, which I think brings us to the thing that we should look at next, which is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as a standalone video game. Looking past the larger implications of what Rebirth means for the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII franchises, how exactly is the game itself? Well, as I continue to argue on this channel, the story is perhaps the key thing that an RPG has to nail, above everything else. Everything in an RPG needs to serve and augment the story and the journey that it sends its player on, whether it's in the gameplay, the mechanics, the structure, player choices, what have you. So, to that point, how is the story of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? Honestly, it's kind of a mixed bag, and the thing that I think highlights both the strengths and the weaknesses of the game as a whole. The one compliment I can give Rebirth's story is that it isn't boring. The story, much like the overall direction of this remake trilogy, is pretty polarizing. See, there are moments where Rebirth truly nails it, where it delivers an emotionally resonant story moment that really does move you in some powerful way. There are solid moments of joy, of elation, of sorrow, and even a sense of mystery in the story of Rebirth. And those moments really rise all the way up to the highs of the entire video game medium as a whole. But, and this is a really big caveat to it all, those moments are almost buried in between a ton of filler, padding, severe pacing issues, and some tonal issues as well. There's also just a genuine sense of friction present between player choice and the more standard linear elements of the narrative. Thus, the story of Rebirth ends up being an odd combination of some really high highs and some seriously below average lows that almost border on absolutely horrendous. There's the big emotional moment at the end that's kind of weird and twisted, but there are also smaller moments that I think really feel like they come out of nowhere but hit exceedingly hard and do it all so well. See, one of the things that Rebirth does, and it does it rather well, is that it develops the other members of the core cast of your party beyond just its main character and the protagonist, Cloud Strife. If Final Fantasy VII Remake was more or less entirely focused on acquainting us with this new version of Cloud, a version that I'd argue is actually a better characterization than the original, then Rebirth does the same for nearly every other member of your core party. There's a ton of examples that can be listed here. The whole thing with Barrett's backstory being revealed expertly with the re-encountering of his old friend Dyne, Nanaki or Red 13's whole return to his hometown of Cosmo Canyon, and learning about his father and the Gi, Tifa and her whole history with Cloud, and how she lost her hometown, Aerith and her destiny as a Cetra, and her relationship to Zack, it all really does work, and it all really does tug at the emotions in different and effective ways. And then of course, even though it's a little bit less successful, there's Cloud himself, who really does see himself break down more and more mentally, and really does come into his role as the unreliable narrator that he was in the original game. Sadly, a big problem is that those moments are actually few and far between. Either preceding or accompanying each of these core pivotal moments is a bunch of either really bizarre, wacky comedy, or something that just feels so tonally jarring when compared to what is essentially a much darker story of tragedy and loss. Really, the major issues with Rebirth's story are in its pacing and its tonal consistency. If you were to look at Rebirth as a whole, as a story, I'd say that it's 70% fun games and jokes, and 30% powerful emotional storytelling. And that really is an issue in a 100+ hour RPG. There is this really interesting, exciting, and dark story that revolves around Sephiroth, around the fate of the planet, and Cloud's own personal mental state and deterioration, not to mention the fate of various other characters in the cast. But it's frequently put to the wayside so that the party can have fun and bond in the various locations and places that they visit in the events of the game. If I were to kind of boil it all down, I'd say that the story and plot for Rebirth and the script or scenario for the game feel like they're very much two separate, almost opposing entities. This, I think, has a lot to do with how Rebirth was made and how it was built during its development cycle. In an interview with prominent Final Fantasy YouTube channel Final Fantasy Union, director Naoki Hamaguchi kind of detailed how they went about creating the story for Rebirth and the Remake Trilogy as a whole.
Okay, so first of all, I personally believe that the main storyline, the core of the narrative, is not something we should have multiple people playing with and changing. So in that sense, very much decided to trust and leave it down to our main story writer, scenario writer, Mr. Nojima Kazushige, and it's up to him to write that, really. However, having said that, the initial script that our story writer comes up with is a written story. It's not really written from the perspective of making it presented as a gameplay experience. So certainly that's when myself and the development team step in, and then the changes and adjustments we make are very much in terms of how that's presented through the game structure, the gameplay itself, and what kind of expressions are used to actually show and communicate that story as a game. So that's where we come in terms of our creative input.
Okay, so looking at that segment, and seeing how the story was written by its lead writer, Nojima Kazushige, in a sort of vacuum, and then in how it was adapted and changed to fit into a video game by the co-directors in Hamaguchi and Toriyama, it's hard not to see the process almost mirroring the sort of process that films go through between the initial script and then the final cut of the film. Unfortunately, it does seem to me like what's written by Nojima and then what's being made by the rest of the Rebirth development team seem to kind of be going in completely different directions. And that divergence is kind of really evident in the game itself. In fact, to kind of belabor this point home, in a post-release interview published in the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth Ultimania, which in this case was translated by Frontline Gaming Japan, there's actually quite a few tidbits to glean with regards to how the story itself was made and how it all came together. I quote, "When asked about the theme of the game, Toriyama says that he and Nojima would have different answers. Nojima says that since the first game was about learning about the characters, Rebirth was about learning about the world that they are in and how the story as a whole, including Zack's world, works. For Toriyama, however, the big theme of the game was balancing story with the freedom to adventure." Even here, you can kind of see that there are differing opinions and goals for what Rebirth's story is supposed to be in terms of its core theme. And this is honestly quite the problem, and is perhaps an issue with how the development of Rebirth itself was structured. There's really no single creative vision or lead that's directing the entire project in a particular direction. Yoshinori Kitase, the executive producer, has his own ideas of what the remake should be. Hamaguchi and Toriyama, the co-directors, have their own opinions. And the writer of the game and this whole trilogy has his, and Tetsuya Nomura, the creative director of 2020's remake and this game, has his own ideas. And they all kind of don't align with one another. Kitase, and perhaps Nojima's original vision was that of boldly changing Final Fantasy VII's story, and they were ultimately convinced away from that. Tetsuya Nomura, on the other hand, is firmly in the preserve the original camp, which always tends to surprise fans since they ascribe the game's more multi-universe, fate-based story elements to him, likely due to his work on the Kingdom Hearts series. And then there's Hamaguchi and Toriyama, who fall somewhere in between and kind of want to put player choice at the forefront of the game's experience. In fact, in another separate interview conducted by Inverse, Naoki Hamaguchi, co-director of Rebirth, had this to say, and I quote, "I personally feel this is a time in which the user involvement is much more desired when playing a game. Having the game be entirely story-based is not enough. So in that way, I think the more action-based way is very much desired within players." Now, we come to a third competing ideal for what the story and the experience of Rebirth should be. One driven by player choice. One that is actually fairly integrated into a core gameplay and storytelling system of Rebirth, and that once again pulls the narrative and storytelling in another direction, further weakening the cohesion of the overall experience. See, in Rebirth, there's a system called the affinity system, which ultimately is supposed to show you how close Cloud is to a particular party member in his group. Various actions in the game, whether it's finishing side quests that are related to a particular character, dialogue choices in pivotal moments of the story, or just simply using the new combo attacks with certain party members during the various battles that are called synergy attacks, all end up affecting Cloud's affinity with certain characters. This, essentially, is more of an expansion to something that was present in 2020's remake, where players could direct Cloud's romantic moments in the game towards a particular character, the choices in that game being Jessie, Tifa, or Aerith. In Rebirth, this is taken up a notch, and pivotal moments such as the 2 gold saucer dates in the game and the big Loveless theatrical play scene can be shaken up by how you engage with this system. Ultimately, this idea of player choice and letting the player roleplay as Cloud and mold his relationships is a really great idea, I think. In fact, I can see a reality where the system, closely integrated with Kitase Nojima's original vision of a sequel, would have made for quite the exceptional and revolutionary game. Imagine, if you will, your choices and actions as you play the game, ultimately shaping the story of the entire Remake Trilogy. You could, if you wanted, follow the path and the story of the original Final Fantasy VII and basically re-experience it as it was originally. Or, through your own choices, you could wind up in a completely different direction, remaking the story as you wanted it to be. What a cool concept that would have been, right? But sadly, that concept, as powerful and exciting as it sounds, isn't what Rebirth ends up doing. Instead, your choices basically amount to who you end up going on a date with in the Gold Saucer, and then you get to share a romantic moment with said person. Now, since you can basically go on said date with almost any character in your core party, it actually ends up making the whole thing kind of meaningless in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't matter if you want Tifa and Cloud to be a couple. The story and the narrative is still pushing towards the Cloud and Aerith dynamic, and how Aerith ultimately dying is a core moment in the story for Cloud, having lost the woman he loves. Which, ultimately, adds some real dissonance to the story as a whole, depending on what your choices in the game are. Again, grand ideas, differing visions that ultimately kind of dilute and perhaps even spoil the overall experience. And speaking of the overall experience, I think it's about time we talked about the other big, massive change that Rebirth introduces, not only in contrast to the remake, but the original Final Fantasy VII as well, the open world. See, the shift to a more open world experience is an interesting one, because Remake, when it first came out, also kind of set up a template for what many fans of Final Fantasy, myself included, felt the series should adopt and ascribe to. Remake introduced a fairly tight linear narrative-based experience, with chapters and moments punctuated by some occasional side content and a few activities, and a battle system that was a fantastic hybrid of both turn-based, strategic command-based combat and the more action-based combat that is perhaps the most popular form of gameplay today. Rebirth definitely both evolves and outright changes aspects of that formula. In Rebirth, the tightly paced narrative experience with some side content is almost thrown out in favor of a more open, exploration style of gameplay for the game's structure. A style that feels like it's more reminiscent of a Western open world game than a Japanese RPG. There are a ton of side quests, of open world exploration activities, mini-games, and optional battles to engage with. One could argue that there's actually too much, and a lot of it ends up feeling excessive and feels like filler as a result. What's perhaps most confusing is that while it may seem like a lot of this filler is optional, it really isn't, because a lot of the side content is not only key to your progression and getting some of the best items and equipment in the game, but it also has key story beats and moments that tie into the larger narrative of the whole Remake Trilogy. Except, it's buried and hidden in between a ton of stuff that may more or less be throwaway content, and that actively hinders the story as a whole. This, I think, is Rebirth's second problem. The fact that the game's structure actively conflicts with the kind of emotional narrative experience that the original Final Fantasy VII was trying to go for in its big story moments. And you really have to wonder, why is this the way it is? I mean, at the end of Rebirth, you end up basically right at the end of the first disc of the original Final Fantasy VII in terms of story and events covered. So, in a trilogy that's supposed to split the story of Final Fantasy VII into 3 games, the first 2 games have basically expanded upon and arguably stretched out the first third of the story. Which, honestly, almost makes you wonder if Rebirth could have had some of its extensive minigames and the open world segments scaled back, and could have potentially covered more ground in the story as a result. See, in a lot of ways, the way I view Rebirth is kind of like a buffet. There's a lot of options on the table for you to pick from, and it's ultimately up to you to decide what you want and how much of it you want. And therefore, it's actually on you to manage your enjoyment of the game. Do you love minigames and side activities? Well, there's tons of variety here, and you can basically pick and choose what you want and how much you want to engage with it. Do you want to just get to the core story? Well, you can do that too, if you so desire. And once again, Rebirth here tries to cater to too many differing tastes. It just kind of gives you so much, giving you open world exploration activities like surveying rocks, finding items, excavating things with your chocobo to get crafting recipes, fighting special enemies to then unlock the zone monster of each area, to then kind of get the ultimate item that can help you to finish a particular side quest, etc, etc, etc. And then there's the minigames. Oh boy, are there a ton of those. The minigames, which people remember fondly from the original Final Fantasy VII, are so jam-packed in this game that it can almost overwhelm you. In the original Final Fantasy VII, most, if not all the minigames, resided entirely inside of the Gold Saucer area of the game, a theme park-like area that the party visits as part of the story. And there, I'd say it would make sense and really work to have a ton of minigames. But Rebirth throws in minigames in almost every area of the game. There's a bunch of minigames in Costa del Sol, for instance, the beach resort-like area of the game, where players have to actively engage with these minigames in order to get a bathing suit for each of the game's characters, so that they can enter a beach area where the black robe characters that they're chasing ultimately are, and advance the story. But then, once you get through the required part of these minigames, several other levels for each of them open up that allow you to get more items or materia that could help you out in the rest of the game. And the game does this minigame trick again and again and again. Take the newly introduced card game, Queen's Blood, for instance. It's fantastic and an entirely fun minigame that is mostly optional and has its own little side story. But there's a particular segment in the game when the party is on a ship traveling from one location to the other that the game makes the whole minigame a required thing to advance the story. And even before that, you have this minigame where Cloud has to hop on top of a dolphin and excite it by popping a bunch of balloons in the water to ultimately reach a ledge that will take him to the upper part of Junon that the team is trying to infiltrate. And once you do this, later on, you can come back and do this again with harder difficulty and more rewards. There are also things like chocobo races, chocobo flying minigames, chocobo collect the item by flying around activities, and a ton more. Most of these are optional at first, but then, when the party members enter the Dust Bowl area of the game, Cloud has to win a chocobo race to free his party and continue to pursue Barrett, who's gone AWOL after an incident in the Gold Saucer. That's to say nothing of the combat challenges that appear in every region via Chadley's VR simulator, that open up to you as you encounter more enemies and explore the open world. And some of these VR challenges, they hold some of the best materia in the game. But then there's also similar challenges in the Gold Saucer, the Dust Bowl, and even in the Shinra Manor basement that's located in Nibelheim. But those rewards can vary in terms of usefulness. So, the repetition and sheer amount of content is staggering, and honestly what that means is really going to vary on a player-by-player basis. In today's day and age, a lot of gamers really value the time spent in a game. How many hours they get for their $70 purchase, for instance. And to that end, I think Final Fantasy VII provides a ton of value and a ton of content. On the flip side, for those of us who love playing games as completionists, for instance, this whole approach of throwing the entire kitchen sink at the player is an absolute nightmare to reckon with. And it kind of shows, in that the trophy and platinum completion percentages for the game are really, really low. So in a lot of ways, going back to the buffet analogy from earlier, the dev team clearly doesn't expect players to engage with and see everything in the game. Instead, it seems like this sheer amount of content is almost there to impress the player, to make them feel like there's so much to do when the actual depth and quality of the material can vary from thing to thing. But there's also not a lot of guidance on what actually is important content and what isn't, which kind of carries over to the game's side quests as well, which can range from absolutely stupid to almost essential in terms of the larger story. There's a quest, for instance, where you literally are stringing along a chicken using a feed box with a string, and trying to lure it back into its pen for this old lady in the Gongaga region of the game. To say that I was questioning my life choices as I went through this quest was putting it mildly. But then, there is a side activity where you're uncovering proto-relics or pieces of Gilgamesh's armor throughout the game. And in the Cosmo Canyon area of the game, this turns into a proper side quest that actually gives you a ton of insight into what happens to Wedge at the end of Remake, a pretty important character from that game. And it also catches you up with some of the characters that you encountered as Yuffie in the intermission DLC of the first game. So yeah, there's a good chance that a player will either miss this entirely or end up having to sift through numerous minigames. Each proto-relic activity in each part of the game's various maps and areas has its own minigames, before you even get to this point. Are the minigames optional? Not all the time, but sometimes, maybe, if you want them to be. This kind of approach, where Rebirth again doesn't fully commit to what it's doing with the minigames, is what ends up frustrating and perhaps diluting the overall experience. And to give the minigames some credit, there are some really great ones that are kind of fun. Queen's Blood, for instance, is an absolute highlight of the game, and provides a real payoff at the end with its story conclusion, which involves Vincent, who's a character that is more of a cameo in this game than anything else. And yet, for every Queen's Blood, there's like 10 other minigames that just feel rushed, unbalanced, and ultimately unfun. I think Rebirth would really have been stronger if it had done less stuff and just refined the things that it did choose to do and do it well. Each minigame is really an entire game or a core mechanic in itself, and there's only so much that those making one video game can do without ultimately doing what Rebirth does and diluting the quality of its entire experience. Now, a big part of that experience of playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is in its combat. And well, the combat is another thing that has some really high highs and some absolute lows. The core combat system for Remake is more or less intact here, and it's just as great as ever. Again, it's worth noting that as Final Fantasy, as a series, continues to move away from its turn-based roots, it's the hybrid approach of Remake that feels like the best of both worlds. Yet, what's weird here is that Rebirth adds a ton of extra mechanics and complexity to Remake's battle system, while outright diluting or changing core aspects of that formula with newer additional mechanics. All the while, some of the core issues of the combat system are kind of left unattended. What's perhaps most impressive about the combat of Rebirth is in how much variety it adds style-wise, with each of the various party members that you control. Remake did an excellent job of differentiating Cloud from Tifa, Barret, and Aerith, and this new version continues to highlight those differences while adding in Yuffie and her combat from the Intermission DLC, and of course, creating an entirely new combat system for Red 13 and Kate Shi. The combat styles are then paired with the weapon ability system, where each weapon comes with its own special ATB command attack that you can learn and add to your arsenal. And learning these abilities actively incentivizes you to switch up who you're playing as in the game's battles, just to make sure you can level up and learn all these abilities, which is a great concept. Less great is the fact that the proficiency bonus requirements to learn these abilities faster can really be insane and kind of cumbersome. And speaking of weapons, one thing that's a clear step down from Remake is the weapon leveling system in Rebirth. Unlike Remake, where each weapon had its own mini Saphir grid, kind of like Final Fantasy X, which gave it stat boosts, new abilities, and materia slots, Rebirth, instead, creates a standardized weapon folio upgrade tree that basically affects all your weapons. And instead of just giving you stats and upgrades to those weapons, this new upgrade tree gives you equipable abilities that you can add to each of your weapon's 3 available slots. Things like expanded materia slots, increasing your ATB gauge, your stats, are entirely removed. And inside this weapon folio system, along with these weapon abilities, are also synergy abilities and skills. The whole synergy system is something entirely new to Rebirth, and it's one of the more interesting and utterly baffling additions to the game. How it works is that there are synergy skills that you can use at any point in battle by holding down the block button and then pressing one of the corresponding face buttons, in this case X, square, circle, or triangle, and 2 of your characters will do some kind of single attack move together. This could be reflecting back a projectile, attacking an airborne enemy, or doing a charge-up attack. Added to this are synergy abilities, which are these awesome, extremely well-animated combo attacks that not only have 2 characters do a flurry of attacks in concert with one another, but give you really beneficial effects. For instance, you can use these synergy abilities to do things like increase your ATB bar from 2 to 3 bars, increase the stagger window for enemies, get unlimited MP, or most important of all, you can increase the level of your limit break attacks, the most powerful attacks you have. The issue, of course, is that the higher versions of your most powerful attacks are locked behind the system and between certain combinations of characters. See, the required bonus effect of a synergy ability is only available with certain character combinations, which ultimately can either limit who you put in the party or your ability to use these higher level limit breaks until you get an equipable accessory fairly late in the game. For instance, the party I tended to gravitate towards, purely based on gameplay style preference, was Cloud, Tifa, and Yuffie. But see, Cloud can only level up his limit breaks by using a synergy ability with Barret or Aerith. Tifa needs Aerith or Red 13, and Yuffie goes with Red 13 and Kaith Sith. So ultimately, the game actively punished me for not using a particular set of characters and locked me out of a ton of bonuses. The freedom to choose your party makeup is actively at odds with the synergy system. And to make matters worse, the affinity system that I mentioned earlier, the one that affects your romantic scenes in the game, that is tied to the use of synergy abilities as well, as using synergy abilities with certain characters increases Cloud's affinity to them. So, let's say I want Cloud to end up with Tifa on the date. I actively can't use Barret or Aerith's synergy abilities with him to level up his limit breaks, lest it affect the one part of the story that I get to have some manner of choice in. The synergy system and the affinity system are great ideas in theory, and actually on their own do promote player choice. But it's in their interaction with the rest of the game that they actively conflict with and even ruin the overall experience, making their inclusion feel ultimately unsatisfying and frustrating. Much like the rest of the game, when these systems work, they work beautifully, allowing you to do some crazy cool looking stuff and dominate your enemies. But when it doesn't work, well, it really brings down the whole experience and creates a ton of frustration. And speaking of frustration, man oh man, can some of the battles in Rebirth be entirely frustrating, unfair affairs. For all the variety and different gameplay styles that Rebirth gives you, there are a ton of battles that have one particular solution and one solution alone. This is perhaps most evident in the challenge battles that you can find throughout the game, which I know are meant to be challenges and puzzles, but these puzzles feel cheap in that they have enemies basically either stun lock you to death for making one mistake, or have instant KO moves that more or less kill your party should you be hit by them. Now, if it were limited to just those challenge battles, then I'd be more or less fine with it all. But there are story boss battles, where the game basically forces you to engage with a particular mechanic above all else. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Rufus Shinra boss battle that happens at the end of Chapter 12. Up till this point, the new perfect block and parry mechanic from the game is more or less an optional element that players can take advantage of if they so desire. Now, I personally really love parry systems in games, so I basically set up Cloud's entire build around this style of play. And with Rufus, you actually need to do this, as the only way to damage him and not get countered yourself is to block perfectly and then parry him, while having a materia equipped that actually builds your ATB on those perfectly executed blocks. To people who either can't execute perfect parries and blocks, or don't have the right build setup, this battle will be more or less hell. With the inability to build up ATB and basically getting constantly bombarded with attacks by Rufus and later on in the battle, him and his hound. This is to say nothing of the various moments where the game actively locks you out of being able to change your party. And well, the encounters have the double whammy of having very specific solutions to them and not letting you use the characters or abilities that you're most comfortable with. And near the end of the game, especially with Rufus, and even with the final boss in Sephiroth, you need to be able to do these perfect blocks and parries, or basically you're unable to complete the game, which ultimately makes this battle system look a lot less impressive than it actually is. All because the encounter design and the boss battle design feel like they're a lot less balanced and properly tuned. Speaking of the boss battles, it's also worth circling back to the story here, in that a lot of the fights that you do end up going through in Rebirth feel kind of meaningless with how the story presents and ultimately concludes them. Nearly every major story character that the party goes up against escapes after the battle is over and lives to fight another day. And a lot of these boss characters are characters that you've already fought in Remake, which adds insult to injury. Remember Don Corneo from the first game? Well, he's back in this game for a segment in Chapter 12, and you fight him again, after the party kind of took care of him quite definitively in Remake. Oh, and he runs away again after this battle is over. You also fight the Turks, multiple times throughout the game, and they almost always make like Team Rocket and blast away again. After every encounter, to the point where these battles feel like they're just out to pad the story, rather than provide some meaningful battle that the characters are undertaking and overcoming. Even two of the biggest boss battles, in Rufus Shinra and Sephiroth, are both enemies that you fought and bested before in Remake. And just like in Remake, it isn't quite time to have these characters get their ending, so they escape after the battle is over, likely to come back in the third installment of this Remake Trilogy. And with the talk of Sephiroth, there is the inevitable discussion of Rebirth's most controversial aspect, the ending of the game. We talked at length about the whole lack of direction with regard to the Remake Trilogy's story and approach, and nowhere is this more evident than in Rebirth's ending. Here, confusingly, shockingly, the pivotal moment of Aerith's death, something that the game has been teasing can be changed, is not only a fixed event, but the entire scene is executed in this vague, confusing way. With Rebirth's ending, the story once again leans on the idea of there being multiple realities or worlds, and in how Sephiroth is actually aware of these multiple worlds and is trying to combine them into one. To that end, there's a world where Cloud saves Aerith, and there's a world where he doesn't. There's even a world where Cloud doesn't even live past the events of the Sector 7 bombing, and where Zack ultimately resides and lives. And these different worlds and events are kinda juxtaposed on top of one another in the pivotal moment where Sephiroth stabs Aerith in the Cetra Temple. Cloud isn't able to save her. Or he does, but it's in another world, but not this one? Or is Cloud, with his mental issues, repressing the entire fact of Aerith's death? And then, in the final battle with Sephiroth that follows this scene, Cloud and Zack end up teaming up for one part of it, as apparently in that moment, realities collide and the two worlds merge. But then, Sephiroth is able to break the realities apart again. Oh, and then we have this whole thing with Tifa, Barrett, and the rest of the party fighting Sephiroth in another reality. Cloud and a revived Aerith then fight him in yet another one, and Zack fights him solo in another reality, all at the same time in parallel. This whole segment feels like it's both there to artificially increase the stakes at the end of the game, but also provide some kind of hollow and shallow fan service to fans. Zack's inclusion in this game, for one, is utterly baffling in that the story really doesn't do much of anything with him. Throughout the game, we get these small scenes with Zack in what is most definitely an alternate world, but Zack really doesn't do much of note in them. And in the end, Zack joins Cloud for one moment to finish off Sephiroth, and then is kind of put back on the shelf, giving you the feeling that the story is really unsure of what to do with him. And as someone who loves Zack, loves him more than Cloud even, it's insanely disappointing to have been teased with Zack's return at the end of Remake, to then getting a chance to play as him at the beginning of Rebirth, and then basically getting nothing from him until the end, with another potential tease for him potentially having a bigger role in the third game of the trilogy. Potentially. Which, in essence, I think brings us to the end of Rebirth and where the Remake Trilogy goes from here. At the end, the core events play out technically the same way they did in the original. Aerith dies, Cloud suffers, and his mental state seems to be getting worse. Cloud has already been controlled by Sephiroth a few times in the game, attacking Tifa, taking the dark materia from Aerith, and giving it to Sephiroth, and acting like a cold killing machine for much of the Temple of the Ancients part of the game. And at the end, Cloud is shown as being able to see Aerith when the other party members can't, ultimately unfazed by her death. Is she a hallucination? Is she now a guiding force that's helping Cloud out? Is this another mind trick from Sephiroth? It's all left up in the air, all to be potentially resolved in Part 3. And the reason for this vagueness, the reason that Rebirth actually messes with what is undoubtedly one of the most epic and iconic moments of the original game? Well, it's done to keep players invested for another few years until the third game eventually comes out. To quote co-director Hamaguchi in an interview that Anime News Network conducted in late 2024, "So, when I was playtesting this game and went through run-throughs countless number of times, I thought that players who were going to play Rebirth were going to have various perspectives and thoughts about the ending. We had already announced from the beginning that this remake series would be a trilogy, so when we considered releasing 3 titles, of course, there will be some time between releasing 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. I also discussed how we want the community to interact while they're waiting for that next installment. Kitase-san and I were also discussing this, but we thought it's very enjoyable for the community to have something very worthy of intense discussion. Like, what is really going on here? That was something we wanted and expected going into creating this scene. In terms of the experience, we anticipated and also desired, I think. We are satisfied in that there are both negative or positive reactions to this scene." End quote. So basically, the entire reason for this weird boss fight with Sephiroth that spans multiple dimensions, the reason for the vagueness of the ending, the obfuscation of the Aerith death scene, is more or less there to build hype and intrigue, to keep players engaged with theories and questions until the next part of the game series comes out. And honestly, this points to one of the biggest questions that I've wondered about since the announcement that the remake was going to be a series of games rather than one. Does it serve the story and the game as a whole to split it up into parts like this? I mean, if you aren't going to go the whole sequel route and are just retelling the same story as before with minor tweaks, then why not just make this one game? Maybe expanding the original Final Fantasy VII to maybe a 100-hour RPG rather than 3 huge ones that may ultimately total 300 hours of runtime when the trilogy is said and done. And the answer to that question is that I think Square-Enix and the team behind the Remake Trilogy just wasn't capable of delivering one single perfect game when they set out to do this. At the time when the Remake Trilogy was started, Final Fantasy as a series was stuck in the transition from the turn-based RPG to the action RPG. It was struggling to engage players with both the storytelling and the gameplay. Remake was a huge learning experience for the team, and they ultimately were able to craft some of the building blocks that were not only used to then build Rebirth, but will eventually be used to make a third game, and then potentially make more games in the larger Final Fantasy series. To that end, Rebirth, with all its stumbles and rough edges, is really laying down the foundation for what a Final Fantasy game is going to be in the future. Will it all come together, and will the third and final game in the Remake Trilogy finally deliver the grand experience that players and the developers have envisioned in their head, a combination of both reverence and nostalgia? I actually believe that it's more than likely that that is exactly what will happen. The unfortunate reality of game development, particularly with regards to Square-Enix and the Remake development team, is that they didn't have a template and a foundation that they could have built upon before both Remake and Rebirth were made. Just like how Larian Studios made the Divinity Original Sin games before they made Baldur's Gate 3, and just like how From Software made Demon's Souls, the Dark Souls games, Bloodborne, and Sekiro before they made Elden Ring, the team behind the Remake Trilogy needed a few games of development and refinement before they could deliver on their grand vision. In many ways, the Remake Trilogy is playing catch-up when it comes to the experience and the tenure that other big successful teams like Larian Studios and From Software have been cultivating for decades. And, to that end, I think that Rebirth, for all the things it does, will likely be remembered as the stepping stone to what may ultimately be a grand third game. If Remake was the proof that a Final Fantasy VII experience can be done right with modern graphics and gameplay sensibilities, then Rebirth is refining and expanding that formula to actually fit in an expansive RPG-level storyline, and with that come a lot of growing pains. So that's where I guess I ultimately sit with Rebirth. Did I love the game? Not really. Do I appreciate it and kind of like aspects of it and feel like it's a step in the right direction for both Final Fantasy and Square-Enix as a whole? Most definitely. Your mileage with this game will vary based on what kind of player you are and what you expect from Final Fantasy. After the last few games, being both 16 and 15, Rebirth is definitely the best game that Square-Enix has put out, in years, decades even. And for that, I really do appreciate what Rebirth does, and the care and effort it must have taken the team behind it to get us all to this point. Is that enough to make this game a memorable one for me? Not really, but I totally get why a sizable chunk of hardcore fans are so happy, and why they really do view this as their game of the year for 2024. I understand it now. I get it. Even if the completionist in me and the Final Fantasy fan in me doesn't quite synergize with what Rebirth is trying to do with its expansive, ambitious, buffet-style, cater-to-everyone approach. In a lot of ways, Rebirth is an extremely ambitious game. Too ambitious, and I'd rather the people behind Final Fantasy games shoot for the sky and get as close as they can, rather than continue to churn out mediocre and ultimately underwhelming experiences that just look beautiful. To that point, I'm curious what your thoughts are after all of this. Does Rebirth resonate with you? Was it your game of the year for 2024? What parts of the game really sung for you? What parts didn't? Did it ultimately succeed, or did it fail for you? This rather long video is just an amalgamation of my feelings on this rather interesting and very ambitious game, and I'd love to discuss this further with you in the comments, as we tend to do on this channel. So sound off below, and let's spend the next few years discussing this rather interesting game until that much awaited third installment comes out.